The night they left me was cold enough to sting. I remember the way the air smelled like wet leaves and Grandma Sybil's lavender tea steeping on the porch. I was clutching my stuffed bear when the car stopped in her gravel driveway. No hugs, no eye contact. Just my mother's voice rehearsed and tight. Be good for Grandma. We'll be back soon. But they never came back. Not the next week, not the next year, not for a whole decade. Until one morning, they walked into her funeral like nothing had happened. Where are you listening from right now? Hit subscribe if you're ready for what came next. People always assumed I must have grown up angry. I didn't, not exactly. Because Grandma Sybil filled the void they left without asking for thanks. She was the kind of woman who read poetry over breakfast, corrected grammar mid-argument, and brewed the strongest lavender tea you'd ever taste. Her house smelled like old books and cedarwood. Her porch creaked like it had a voice of its own. Larkspur Hollow wasn't some big city, just a fog-wrapped lakeside town where neighbors nodded instead of waved. But in that quiet I bloomed. She never tried to erase what happened, never lied. She'd just say, some people choose the wrong kind of silence. When I'd cry at first, often she didn't fill the space with distractions. She let me feel, then read to me until I fell asleep, her voice like shelter from the storm. She was strict, brilliant, a former literature professor who could slice through nonsense with a single raised eyebrow. But she was never cold. She was fire, just tempered. As I grew, she gave me room to question everything, but always made sure I questioned myself first. A sharp mind, she said, means nothing without a strong spine. We didn't have luxury, but we had books, we had plans, we had tea at 4 p.m. every single day. I stopped looking out the window by the time I turned 12. By 16, I didn't think of my parents unless someone mentioned them in passing, and nobody ever did. The town knew, they just didn't speak on it. That was Larkspur Hollow's way. And then came my 18th birthday. Grandma Sybil had reserved the upstairs corner of Wren's Cafe, the place with crooked chairs and blueberry pie that always tasted like it was made just minutes ago. My friends came, teachers, even her old colleague from the university. She wore plum-colored lipstick and a scarf that matched the lake's misty hue. I thought it was just another one of her stylish whims, but now looking back, it was a goodbye costume. When the party ended and we stood on the porch together, she pressed a small velvet box into my hand. Inside was a delicate gold chain. Hanging from it was a miniature key, thin, ornate, cool to the touch. Is it for something? I asked. She smiled, her eyes glassy but fierce. One day you'll know, but until then wear it close. And I did. Even now I still do. What I didn't know that night, what none of us knew, was that in just 3 months, I'd be wearing it to her funeral. The church smelled like old wood candle smoke and winter air soaked through stone. I sat in the front pew, clutching a crumpled tissue in one hand and the tiny gold key around my neck in the other. The choir hummed softly. People spoke in hushed voices. Everything felt still, until I felt it, that sharp, invisible chill across the back of my neck, like being watched by a memory that hadn't earned its return. I turned, and there they were. Coraline and Desmond Merrin, my parents, standing in the entryway of St. Alder's like they belonged there. Her hair was perfectly styled but thinner. His jaw was heavier, as if guilt had weight. They both wore black. They both wore lies. They walked down the aisle with practiced grace. Heads turned. Someone gasped. I could barely breathe. Coraline's eyes found mine. She smiled like we had lunch plans. Isolde, darling, she whispered, reaching for my shoulder. I stood before she could touch me. The choir fell silent. Desmond stepped in, voice low and full of rehearsed regret. We came as soon as we heard. We're sorry about your grandmother. I said nothing. I couldn't. My entire body was frozen, not with fear but fury I didn't yet know how to wield. We'll take you home after the service, Coraline said, firmer now. You've been through enough. And technically, you're still a minor, so it's time to come back with us. That was when my vision narrowed. Come back. Come back. Where? To the people who left me in the driveway like a forgotten coat. To the silence they wrapped around me for 10 straight years. I looked at her, this woman who birthed me, and wondered if she'd even recognize the sound of my laugh. She didn't look at me like a daughter. She looked at me like property that had become inconveniently unavailable. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said quietly. Her smile twitched. Don't be difficult. I stared straight ahead, voice like granite. I'm not being difficult, I'm being clear. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, someone stepping forward from the back row. A tall man in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. Excuse me, he said calmly. My name is James Ellison. I represent the estate of Sybil Merrin, and we need to speak urgently. The way my parents flinched at his words, I knew then Grandma saw this coming. The back chamber of St. Alder's was small bare stone walls, a heavy oak table, and silence so thick it made every movement sound like thunder. James Ellison opened his briefcase with the calm precision of someone who had done this before. My parents sat across from him, eyes sharp, backs stiff. I stayed silent, seated to the side, watching everything. He slid a stack of documents across the table. Before we begin, I need you both to understand what's about to be discussed is legally binding. Desmond scoffed. We're her parents. We don't need a lecture. James didn't blink. You'll want to listen anyway. He adjusted his glasses, then cleared his throat. As executor of Sybil Merrin's estate, I've been instructed to execute her final will and testament in the presence of her next of kin. That includes you and Mrs. Merrin by blood only. Coraline leaned forward. And what exactly did she leave? James didn't answer with words. Instead, he turned a page and began to read. To my granddaughter, Isolde Merrin, I leave the full sum of my estate, including property investments and cash assets, totaling approximately $40 million. Silence. Then, what Coraline's voice cracked like glass. Desmond stood abruptly. That's impossible. She was a school teacher. She was a university professor, James corrected, unfazed. And a remarkably successful investor. He pulled out another envelope. And, per the legal records in 2013, when Isolde was 8, you both signed over full guardianship to Sybil Merrin, citing personal hardship and temporary absence. You never responded to follow-up court summons, which resulted in a permanent transfer of custody. He slid the papers across. Desmond stared. Coraline went pale. This she stammered. We were young. That was never meant to be permanent. But it became permanent, James replied. Because you never came back. Their faces morphed from confusion to horror to fury. She manipulated us, Coraline hissed. She turned our daughter against us. I finally spoke. No, you did that all on your own. Desmond pointed a trembling finger. You can't seriously expect us to just walk away. James closed the briefcase. You already did 10 years ago. That line hit harder than any gavel. No yelling, no screaming, just the finality of truth. They hadn't come for me. They'd come for the money. But what they found was a wall built from every silent year they left behind. James reached into the lining of his briefcase and carefully pulled out a slim, cream-colored envelope. My name, Isolde Sybil Merrin, was written in slanted cursive ink, slightly faded edges, softened by time. She asked me to give you this, James said gently when the moment came. I took it with both hands. My fingertips tingled against the paper. It smelled faintly of cedar and chamomile. Coraline leaned forward. What is that? James turned to her calmly. It's not for you. The room shrank. My heartbeat was louder than the ticking clock above the mantel. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages, recognizing every curve of her handwriting, every elegant loop, like a quiet whisper from the past. My dearest Isolde, if you're reading this, it means the truth can no longer stay buried. You always ask quietly, then less and less, why your parents left. I saw it in your eyes, the ache, the doubt. You blamed yourself. You shouldn't have. They didn't leave because they had to. They left because they thought they could steal everything from me. My breath caught. I read faster, knuckles whitening. Years ago, while I was recovering from surgery, they attempted to transfer my estate into their names. They thought I was too tired, too old, too blind to notice. But I noticed, and I confronted them. I gave them a choice, live honestly and stay in our lives, or walk away and lose everything. They chose the second. They chose greed over you. The words blurred. I blinked once, twice. My throat burned. All those birthdays they missed. All the windows I waited behind. None of it was by accident. None of it was because of hardship. It was because I wasn't enough to outweigh $40 million. I continued reading. I never regretted taking you in. You were the greatest gift their cruelty ever handed me. I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't want that ugliness to live inside you. But now you need to know they will try to twist the truth. They will call it a misunderstanding. It wasn't. Stand tall, my darling girl. We Merrin women do not fold. Not to lies, not to blood, not to thieves wearing smiles. All my love, Grandma Sybil. I lowered the letter slowly. The silence in the room pulsed. Coraline's mouth was moving, but I heard nothing. I wasn't listening anymore. The final piece had clicked into place. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had tried to erase Grandma Sybil and failed. James stood up slowly, slid his chair back with a soft scrape of wood against stone. There's one more thing, he said, reaching into the side pocket of his briefcase. A silver USB. He walked toward the modest television tucked into the corner of the room, next to an antique bookshelf and a bowl of half-wilted carnations. She made me promise, he said, plugging the drive in. This would only be played if certain people decided to return. The screen flickered, everyone froze. Then, there she was, Grandma Sybil seated in her study. framed by the glow of a fireplace behind her. Same silk scarf from my birthday. Same steady gaze I'd memorized since I was 8. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile people mistake for kindness until they hear the words. "Only if you're watching this," she began. "Then Coraline and Desmond Merrin have come back. Not for my funeral, but for my fortune." Coraline gasped. "How dare?" James raised a hand. "Let her speak." Sybil leaned forward, her fingers clasped. "Why? Let me make one thing clear," she said. "They didn't just leave my granddaughter, they tried to steal everything I built. And when I didn't let them, they walked away both from the money and the child they brought into this world." The air left the room. Sybil's eyes narrowed slightly, voice sharpening. "They're watching this. I want them to know you didn't break her. You didn't win. You didn't even scare me." My hands shook, but not from fear. From the force of everything she had shielded me from. From the knowledge she had planned even this moment. "Ban," to Isolde. She continued, softening now. "This is yours, all of it. The money, the house, the foundation, because I know you'll use it not to hoard, but to build, to protect, to carry forward something they never could legacy." Then came the final blow. "And to Coraline and Desmond, let me leave you with this." She reached into her desk drawer, lifted a copy of the legal document they'd signed all those years ago. The same one James had slid across the table. "And you gave her away," she said flatly. "And now you don't get to take her back." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence afterward was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The sun was already setting when Coraline found me behind the chapel, near the old willow tree that Grandma used to sit under during choir rehearsals. I was still wearing black, still gripping the letter, still hearing Sybil's voice in my head. "Isolde," my mother began softly, her heels crunching the gravel. "Please, just give me a minute." I didn't look at her. She came closer anyway. "I know you're angry. I know this is complicated. But sweetheart, we didn't mean for things to turn out like this." Her voice was low, sweetened with something fake and sticky, like syrup left too long in the sun. "We were struggling. Your father had health problems. We made bad choices, but we always planned to come back." I turned toward her slowly. 10 years, I said, voice quiet. "That's not a delay, that's abandonment." She blinked. We didn't know how to fix it." My fingers brushed the key necklace. "You didn't even try." Coraline's eyes welled up with what she wanted me to believe were tears. "You have no idea how many times I wanted to call." I stepped forward once, just enough for her to stop speaking. "Then why didn't you?" She flinched. "Why didn't you come for me? Not even once. Not for my birthdays. Not when I broke my arm in 6th grade. Not when I won the state essay contest. Nothing." She said nothing. There it was, the silence I had grown up with. I knew it too well to mistake it for regret. I looked down at the key, then back at her. "That was the last time you called me your daughter." Then I walked away, leaving her beneath the willow. And just like that, I buried more than Sybil that day. I buried whatever was left of that word, family. 3 weeks after the funeral, I moved back into Grandma Sybil's house. Not because I wanted to preserve memories, but because I had work to do. The Merrin estate sat quietly at the edge of Lake Gossamer, 2 stories of cedar wood gray shutters and ivy that clung like old secrets. The study still smelled like pipe tobacco and lemon oil. The desk where she filmed that video, I kept it untouched. For now, the lawyers arranged everything: my legal emancipation, transfer of assets, and access to the private vault of Merrin Foundation. Turns out Sybil Merrin hadn't just amassed wealth. She had built something behind the curtain, a full charitable foundation, one I'd never even heard about. Tucked into her estate portfolio were blueprints, mission statements, staff proposals, even vetting criteria for which causes to support. The headline written in her own hand: "A Future for the Forgotten." The mission scholarships, housing support, mental health resources, all for abandoned or neglected children across New Hampshire. And now, I was its sole director. The first board meeting was brutal. 4 older men, 1 gray-haired woman, and a 20-page agenda I barely understood. I wore Grandma's old navy blazer, the one with the elbow patches and silver buttons. It still smelled like lavender. They looked at me like I was a tribute, not a leader. Until I spoke. Until I quoted Sybil word for word from her foundation notes. Until I pushed back on a proposed budget cut to community mental health clinics and cited research I had read at 2 a.m. the night before. The air changed. They started nodding. They started listening. By the end of the meeting, the youngest board member pulled me aside and whispered, "You sound just like her." I didn't say it, but I knew. Because she raised me. Meanwhile, Coraline and Desmond began their next move. They started small requests for mediation, lawyer letters about family reconciliation, veiled suggestions that I was too young to manage such responsibility. Then came the article. A local news site ran a story. Anonymous source close to the Merrin family claims the will had been manipulated, that Sybil had been mentally unstable in her final years, and that her granddaughter was under undue influence. I stared at the headline for a full minute. Then I shut my laptop, because I already knew what this was. Desperation. They couldn't break the law, so now they were trying to break perception. A week later, my phone buzzed. The board had received a cease and desist demand from Coraline and Desmond's legal team, claiming they had parental rights over me, and therefore standing to oversee the foundation. I was 18, emancipated, fully independent, but they were still clawing. James Ellison and I sat in the sunroom that afternoon, folders spread across the glass table, the lake glittering behind us. They'll try everything, he said. Defamation, media pressure, maybe even public protest. I stared at the framed photo of Sybil on the shelf. Her eyes were soft but never uncertain. They can try, I said. I unclipped the first stack of grant applications. They won't win, because Grandma hadn't just left me money. She left me blueprints, and I wasn't going to waste them. It started with shouting. I was in the third-floor meeting room at Merrin Foundation when security radioed up, "Miss Merrin, we have your parents at the front gate. They've brought press." I paused. Of course they had. I walked down calmly, blazer button, clipboard in hand. Outside the glass entrance, Coraline and Desmond were flanked by 2 tabloid cameras. A local blogger and a woman in heels holding a mic far too confidently. They didn't see me at first. Coraline was crying on cue. "He's our daughter," she sobbed. "She's been taken from us. We just want to make sure she's okay." Desmond added, "We have concerns about the financial ethics behind the sudden transfer of power." That was when the door opened. I stepped out the wind, catching my hair just enough to make it look cinematic. Cameras turned. Coraline froze mid-sentence. "Hello," I said clearly. "You must be here for the show." Gasps. The mic swung toward me. "Miss Merrin," the reporter started, "your parents claim they've been locked out of your life and your late grandmother's legacy. How do you respond?" I didn't look at Coraline. I looked into the lens. "Would you like to see the proof?" I asked. 20 minutes later, we had a press room set up in the main conference hall. I had James Ellison on one side, a copy of Sybil's signed will on the other. We didn't go live. We didn't scream. We presented. James explained the timeline: legal guardianship transfer, court confirmations, financial audits done years prior. Then I took the mic. I told them about the necklace, the tea, the nights I waited by the window. I didn't cry, didn't rage, I informed. Then I pulled out a printed copy of the letter. I read it, every word, including, "They tried to steal everything, and when I said no, they left her too." Coraline stood, face pale, voice trembling. She twisted the truth. "You don't know what we've been through." I raised my eyes to hers. "Then why didn't you show up?" No answer. One reporter asked, "Do you deny trying to transfer Sybil's estate into your names 10 years ago?" Desmond turned red. "That's a private matter." "No," I said, turning to the audience. "This is a public trust. Because Merrin Foundation isn't about legacy, it's about responsibility." The next morning, the headline read, "Heir to 40 Maltonge Foundation confronts estranged parents with grandmother's final words." And below it, "She didn't raise me with rage, she raised me with receipts." That afternoon, Coraline and Desmond left town. No lawsuits, no camera crews, just silence, the only thing they'd ever really given me. I returned to my office, poured a cup of Sybil's favorite oolong, and signed off on the foundation's first major scholarship round. 12 kids, 12 stories like mine. But this time they wouldn't be left behind. Because I hadn't just inherited wealth. I had inherited warfare with grace. And I intended to win with it. It was a Tuesday. The rain had just stopped and the lake shimmered like glass through the bay windows of my office. I was reviewing the final shortlist for the Merrin Fellowship candidates when my assistant knocked, her voice uncertain. "They're back." I didn't need to ask who. They stood in the lobby of the foundation building like ghosts refusing to fade. No cameras this time. No tears. Just tight jaws, manicured anger, and a manila envelope gripped in Desmond's hand like a weapon. "We're not leaving," Coraline said. "Unless we're heard." I stepped forward, calm, collected. "You were heard," I replied. "You were just believed." Desmond opened the envelope and slid a photo across the receptionist's desk. A screenshot. Me mid-sentence reading Sybil's letter, face sharp, mouth half open, spun for malice. "We have footage," he said. "Clips, angles, we'll sell it. Paint you as a cold, ungrateful heiress who turned on her family." He leaned in. "The press will eat it up. We've already spoken to—" I raised a hand. "You've already lost." He paused. "Excuse me? You left your daughter in a stranger's driveway and drove off," I said louder now for the staff to hear. No explanation. No letters. Not even a call on my 10th birthday. Coraline tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. You faked concern, you faked grief. You faked being parents until there was something to take. My voice didn't shake. Not this time. Go ahead, I said, stepping closer. Tell the world. Pitch your story. See who believes the parents who sold out a child for a bank account. Desmond's face paled. Coraline's hand curled into a fist. You'll regret this, she whispered. I tilted my head. No, Mom, you will. They left. Not with fire, not with fanfare, but with the quiet descent of people who finally realized there was nothing left to burn. Later that week, they tried once more, one last grasp. They posted a grainy video to an anonymous blog with a title meant to stir pity. Daughter destroys family to keep inheritance. It barely reached 200 views before James had it legally removed. But I kept a copy, not as proof, as a reminder, because something strange happens when the lies die. The silence becomes peaceful again. Fallout came and passed. Reporters moved on, board members leaned in. And I stayed standing. I hosted a roundtable with other foundations speaking on ethical leadership. The crowd applauded not because I was young or rich, but because I was honest. I wore Sybil's brooch that day, and afterward I visited her grave for the first time since the funeral. The willow trees had started to bloom again. The lake behind shimmered soft and still. I sat beside her stone for a long while, told her everything. The winds, the noise, the calm. And when I stood to leave, I whispered, "You didn't just save me, you taught me how to save myself." As I walked away, the breeze picked up gently. Or maybe that was just her. Either way, I didn't look back. A year later, the lake was still quiet, still reflective, still faithful, just like her. We'd awarded 24 Merrin Foundation scholarships by spring, full tuition housing mentorships. Some of the kids cried when they got the call. One boy asked if it was a prank. It never was. Every single name I read personally. Every application I reviewed myself. Not because I had to, because I knew what it meant to be forgotten. I still lived in the house. Not for nostalgia, though, there was plenty of that. But because it was efficient and warm and it held her scent in the curtains. Sybil's books still lined the hallway shelves. Her tea tins still filled the cabinet. Her old Toyota still parked in the garage. People asked why I didn't upgrade, get something flashy, move somewhere bigger. But how could I? This was the home that saved me. And I had work to do. I'd started journaling again. Grandma used to say, "You don't know what a moment really meant until you write it down." So I did. I wrote about the first time I gave a speech and didn't shake. I wrote about the time a girl from Concord told me she wanted to be just like Sybil Merrin. I wrote about the first night I went to sleep, without expecting anyone to leave. And every morning I still wore the key. It didn't open a door. It opened a future. They came for a fortune. She left me a legacy. And now, it's mine to protect. What would Reddit say? Drop your vote. Subscribe for more stories that hit close to home.